With 3.3 getting closer, there's been a lot of focus on where the story is heading, what's going to happen, how everything is going to play out, and whether all of this setup is actually going to land. And in the middle of all that, there's one character that stands out more than it might seem at first: Hiyuki. Not just because she's a new character or because of the role she might play later, but because of how the story is already using her. Even with the little we've seen so far, she introduces something that you don't usually get in this kind of storytelling: a sense of direction. Not in the sense that everything becomes predictable or that the outcome is obvious, but in the way the story starts to feel like it's moving towards something specific instead of just unfolding step by step without a clear endpoint. And that's where things get interesting. Yuki isn't just another piece being added to the board, she changes how you read the story itself. So instead of just looking at her as a character, I want to break this down from a few different angles, starting with what she actually does for the structure of the story, then moving into the whole idea behind her being a shrine maiden and what that might imply, and finally touching on how all of that translates into her design and execution. Because there's a lot more going on here than it looks at first. Before getting into what Hiyuki is as a character, it's worth looking at what she does for the story itself, because that's where things start to feel a little different from what we usually see in gacha storytelling. Most of the time, these stories rely heavily on uncertainty. The narrative moves forward step by step, new elements get introduced along the way, and the audience is left trying to piece together where everything is going, often without a clear sense of direction until much later. The tension comes from not knowing what the plan is, how things connect, or where it all leads. That approach works, and it's used for a reason. At the same time, it also means that a lot of these stories feel reactive. Events happen, characters respond, and the larger picture only starts to form once enough pieces are in place. Hiyuki changes that dynamic. Her presence doesn't reveal the outcome, and it doesn't make the story predictable, but it does something else entirely. It gives the narrative a visible trajectory. There's a sense that things are moving toward a specific point, even if the path itself is still unclear, and that shift matters. Once that direction is established, the tension starts to come from a different place. The question is no longer just what is going to happen, but how it's going to happen. What is going to take to get there, and more importantly, what might go wrong along the way. That's where Hiyuki becomes interesting. She doesn't function as a solution that resolves the conflict. If anything, she feels more like something that exists at the end of it, a possibility, a fallback, something that might only come into play once everything else has already failed. That kind of setup isn't very common in this space. Instead of keeping everything hidden until the last moment, the story introduces a piece that subtly reshapes how you read everything that comes before it. It creates an expectation without explaining it, and that expectation lingers in the background as the story moves forward. You can feel that something is being built toward. You just don't know what the cost is going to be when it finally happens, and that's what makes her stand out. Not just as a character, but as a narrative tool that changes how the story creates tension in the first place. Now, before going further into Hiyuki herself, it's worth taking a step back and looking at what it actually means for her to be a shrine maiden in the first place, because that idea carries a lot more weight than it might seem at a glance. In the traditional sense, a shrine maiden, or Miko, is not defined by raw power. They're not typically portrayed as the source of something extraordinary, but rather as a bridge between the human world and something beyond it. Their role is tied to rituals, communications, and meditation, acting as an intermediary for a higher force rather than replacing it. Once we look at it from that perspective, the way Hiyuki is framed starts to feel a little different. Calling her a wish-granting Miko already suggests a deviation from that traditional role. It implies something more direct, more active, almost as if the power is hers to use freely. At the same time, that raises a question. Is it actually her power, or is she simply the one channeling it? That's where things start to connect with what we know, or rather what we've been told about the world itself. In Lahai Roi, there's no active Sentinel. What exists instead is the Exostrider, the mechanism that once delivered those Sentinels into the world. The assumption, based on what the story tells us, is that the Sentinel tied to this region is gone. But that assumption feels a little too clean. If Hiyuki fits into the role of a Miko, not just in name but in function, then the idea that she's acting as a medium for something larger becomes a lot harder to ignore. And if that's the case, then the absence of a Sentinel doesn't necessarily mean it's gone. It could mean something else entirely. Dormant, hidden, incomplete, or simply existing in a form that isn't immediately recognizable. And if that's true, then Hiyuki being connected to it, being its resonator, starts to make a lot of sense. It would explain why her ability is framed the way it is, why it carries that sense of scale, and why she's positioned as something that might only come into play when everything else fails. A Shrine Maiden doesn't act on her own, she invokes, channels, or responds to something beyond her. Which means whatever Hiyuki represents isn't just about her, it's about what she's tied to. That's where the idea of wish granting becomes a lot more interesting, because in most cases abilities like that are never as simple as they sound. They tend to come with conditions, limitations, or consequences that only become clear once they're actually used. So instead of looking at Hiyuki as a character who can fix things, it might be more accurate to see her as something that introduces a different kind of risk into the story. Not a guaranteed solution, but a last resort, something that exists at the edge of the narrative waiting for the moment where everything else breaks down. And if that moment does come, then whatever she's connected to is going to matter far more than the title she's given. Now, when it comes to Hiyuki's combat style, this is where things get a bit more complicated. Not because there's something fundamentally wrong with it, it's more about what it could have been. On its own, her design works. She feels smooth to play, her animations are well done, and the overall presentation matches what you would expect from a character in this position. There's nothing here that feels out of place or poorly executed. At the same time, once you start looking at her through the lens of what she represents, there's a noticeable gap between concept and execution. Because Hiyuki isn't just any character, she's framed as a Shrine Maiden, and that comes with a very specific identity. Traditionally, Shrine Maidens aren't associated with direct, weapon-focused combat. Their role leans more toward rituals, purification, and interaction with forces beyond the physical. When the idea is translated into gameplay, especially in modern media, it usually shows up through things like barriers, talismans, seals, or abilities that influence the battlefield in less direct ways. At first glance, that kind of toolkit might seem like it would naturally push her into a support role, but it doesn't have to. That's where the real missed opportunity is. Those same concepts could just as easily be turned into an act, from talismans that detonate or stack effects, from purification techniques that escalate into something destructive. Not less active, just different. And more importantly, more aligned with what she represents. That kind of approach would have allowed her combat style to reflect her identity in a much stronger way, tying her gameplay directly to the same ideas that define her role in the story. Instead, what we get leans much more into a conventional direction, and again, that result is still effective. She's still a strong character and her combat still feels good to use, but it doesn't fully explore what makes her unique. You can see where the idea starts, but it doesn't go as far as it could. And that's where the sense of missed potential comes from, not from a lack of quality, but from the fact that the concept itself allows for something more distinctive, something that could have connected her narrative identity and her gameplay much more tightly. As it stands, the pieces are there, they just don't align as closely as they could. When we put all of this together, it becomes a lot clearer why Hiyuki stands out as much as she does. I already touched on her briefly in the previous video, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like she deserved a closer look on her own. Hiyuki isn't just interesting in isolation, she's interesting in the way she interacts with the structure of the narrative itself. Through her, the story introduces something you don't usually see in gacha storytelling. A sense of direction that exists before the payoff. Not a mystery that slowly reveals itself over time, but a presence that makes you feel like something is already set in motion even if you don't fully understand it yet. That alone changes how you engage with the story. You're no longer just following events as they happen, you're watching them unfold with the awareness that they're building towards something that's already been placed in the narrative, and that shift carries through everything else. It influences how her role as a Shrine Maiden is interpreted, especially if that role ties her to something larger than herself. It reframes her abilities not as a simple solution, but as something that might only come into play under very specific circumstances. Even her combat design, despite not fully committing to that identity, still hints at a concept that could have been pushed further. All of it points in the same direction. Hiyuki isn't just another addition to the cast, she's a pivot point, a character that quietly reshapes how the story builds tension, how it sets expectations, and how it prepares for what's coming next. And that's ultimately why she works so well, because we don't fully understand her yet, and at the same time it still feels like she's already important, like she's been placed there for a reason, and when the story finally reaches that point, that's when we'll see what she was really meant to do. So yeah, overall, Hiyuki ended up being a much more interesting character than I initially expected. There's clearly something being set up here, and depending on how they decide to use her, she could end up being one of the most important pieces in the entire arc. But that's also where a lot of the uncertainty still is. We don't really know how her abilities work yet, we don't know how far they go, and we definitely don't know what the cost of using them is going to be, if there is one. So for now, a lot of this is still in the space between setup and payoff, and that's exactly why I find her interesting. But I'm curious what you think about this. Do you see her more as a setup for something bigger, or do you think the story is going to handle her in a more straightforward way? And also, how do you feel about her design overall, especially when it comes to how her gameplay connects to her identity? If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.